Welcome back to Zilog and Moto. If you watched last week's video and are confused by the content of this week's video, don't worry, I'm going to explain. And if you didn't watch last week's video, well, you should watch and educate yourself about 35-year-old 8-bit soccer games, because that's super important in 2019. At the end of the video, I mentioned that this week we would be looking at a conversion of a Neo Geo title, but not necessarily one of the more famous ones. Well, apparently that series is obscure even to me. So, spoiler alert, that's not really a spoiler alert since the video hasn't been made yet. I was originally planning on reviewing Takara's conversion of Kingdom Monsters 2. The only fighting game we've done so far is Shaq Fu, and I wanted to get away from sports titles after last week. And the last Godzilla movie did come out a few months ago, so it seemed like a good time. I even started to play Kingdom Monsters 2, and found out that Takara deviated a bit from the Neo Geo version when they did their conversion, to the point to where there's a credit on the game that says reprogrammed by Takara, which you don't usually see on arcade ports. So I started to do some research on that end, and in doing so I found out that the original Kingdom Monsters have been ported to the Genesis as well. And I had no idea because I'd never seen it, or if I had, I certainly didn't remember. So, quick trip to eBay later, and now I've got original Kingdom Monsters, and I'll get that on the schedule for maybe like next month or something. In the meantime, that still left me needing a video to look at this week. And of course, due to this switching around and redoing some of the tech stuff I use to do these videos, I was going to be late with whatever I do again. But I didn't want to go the shooting gallery route and just do a quick, simple game either. So after looking at the shelves, I decided on Spider-Man and Venom, Maximum Carnage, to tie into Spider-Man Far From Home being in theaters right now. That movie's pretty decent. However, Maximum Carnage is a game I remember from back in the day really wanting to like, but it just wasn't quite there. I like doing all these reviews because ones where I have distinct memories of playing in the past always interest me, because I wonder if the problem in the past was the game or me not really fully understanding the game. This game is based on the comic book storyline of the same name that was released the year before, 1993. Spider-Man was pretty hot at the time, primarily due to Todd McFarlane's previous run with the comic book, and the introduction of Venom as a character as sort of an anti-hero. Rather than simply have the two characters fight each other all the time, Marvel mixed things up with a classic pro wrestling maneuver where two rivals join forces to combat an even worse, more dangerous enemy. And with that, Maximum Carnage is born. What was also hot in 1993 was the beat-em-up genre, aka my favorite game genre. It's somewhat fallen by the wayside these days, as they're not featured in arcades anymore for the most part, other than that reboot of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that recently came out. And it's definitely more difficult to make a good 3D beat-em-up than a 2D game. But I'm still partial to them. So my favorite genre in a comic book-based game that centers around a popular story. What could go wrong? Well, let's take a closer look. Okay, here we have my copy of Maximum Carnage, and it's definitely not in perfect shape. Looking at the front cover, you can see that it's a bit banged up with some scratches and stuff. Like say, around here, and some scratches there, and all that. And no actual holes, that's good. The upper corner here, though, does have a nice little chunk taken out of it. Assume it got dropped at some point. And then the entire inner cover up here, the top is worn. Unfortunately, this is just one of those scenarios where the that inner cover just rode up, and whoever owned it didn't bother to take the 30 seconds to fix it. So unfortunately, but I got it fixed now at least, so that won't get any worse. The hang tab is intact though, so that's nice. The cover itself has the art from Maximum Carnage trade paperback and shows Spidey and Venom at the bottom, down here. And then along with an MA13 rating. I think the MA13 rating is a bit much. There's no blood here, but I kind of understand as it is a beat 'em up. On the back cover, we get 7 screenshots of the game and a bit of flavor text. and pictures of all the heroes in the game. The screenshots could have been a bit sharper. If you look at them, they're a little fuzzy. You can tell the way they're cropped. It definitely looks like someone was taking a picture of the screen where the game was being played rather than actually doing a proper screen capture. But I guess, B for effort or something. And then also, due to that lack of quality, it's kind of hard to tell who some of these characters are. I mean, once you've played the game, you know exactly who all these people are supposed to be, but without playing the game, it's, a little tricky. Also, in a note down by the bottom, really small here, you'll see featuring music by Green Jelly. More on that in a minute. As we open the case, you see the manual and the cartridge. And the manual has some issues similar to the outer case in that it's slightly beat up. But it's intact and fully readable. And I gotta say, I really like this manual. It's not in color, but it is in grayscale. And it's very thorough. There's a full section explaining the basic controls. And it mentions in here, like, what the buttons do if you've got a 6-button controller instead of a 3-button. And you definitely should play this game with the 6-button controller. Just throwing that out there right now. There's no reason to try to play this with a 3-button. And, a screen with all the power-ups. And then some discussion of all the different superheroes and their backstories and everything. And then even, some write-ups of the different levels in the game and what you can expect as you go through. It's the only way the manual could be any better is if it was in color, which unfortunately, we don't get on the Genesis titles for whatever reason. As far as the cartridge is concerned, you can see here that the game came out in a few different versions. The most notable one is the original manufacturing run that had bright red cartridges. You can see this is not a bright red cartridge. This is the black cartridge. And, I thought about picking up a loose red copy of the game to go and put in here. As they're not that expensive. But this review was already running late. So I decided to skip it. Maybe one of these days when I'm at a convention, if I see it laying around, I'll pick it up. And speaking of conventions, beyond just having a red versus black version of the cartridges, there's also a super limited edition of this game that was apparently sold on QVC that also includes an oversized box, some pins, a hardcover trade comic book, and a certificate of authenticity. And then, of course, this game and, everything that goes along with it. I've seen this edition once or twice at shows, and it's cool to look at to be sure, but there's no way I'd ever spend $500 or so that it's currently commanding. It's just not that good a game. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Now let's take a closer look at the game itself and see just why I say I wouldn't effectively drop the price of an Xbox One X on it. First things first, I have to admit, I've never read the series of comic books that this particular game is based on. It was released at a time when I wasn't really reading that many comic books, and the ones I were reading were primarily X-Men based. So other than hear others talk about Spider-Man or playing the video games that were based around the character, I didn't have much of a point of reference. Since then, I've read a bunch of Spider-Man and Venom related titles, and a few dealing specifically with Carnage as well, so I definitely have a lot better idea about the nuances of the characters now. But unfortunately, none of those stories were Maximum Carnage, so I can't really go into detail as to just how closely the game mirrors the series. But from everything I've read about the series, and from what I've played in the game, it looks to be a faithful adaptation. The game starts out with a cutscene straight from the art panels in the books, and soon after setting up the initial plot, you're launched into the first level, exploring the New York City streets as Spider-Man. The rest of the game proceeds in a similar manner. Finish a level, get a cutscene, rinse, repeat. Some of the cutscenes are done in the game engine with speech bubbles appearing over the characters' heads, and some are done via the same style of taking the art directly from the book, and both types are done very well and used appropriately. To me, it really feels like playing an interactive comic book, much more than other comic book related video games at the time, some of which would just felt like generic action games that happen to have comic book characters as your avatar. Along with the colorful cartoonish graphics and large character sprites, another thing the game does well is its audio. Remember how I mentioned earlier that the game had advertised having music by Green Jelly? Well, it does, in a 16-bit sound chip manner. If you've ever played Rock and Roll Racing, you'll know what I mean. And if you haven't, well, let's just say the game's theme song rocks. I'm not sure if that main theme is the only one written by Green Jelly, or if some of the other songs are their compositions as well. And if you're confused by me mentioning that name, they were originally named Green Jello until they got sued, and were a Gwar-type band that had a hit in the mid-90s with Three Little Pigs. One of the other tracks is a sound-alike of The Mob Rules by Black Sabbath, but I'm not sure you could absolutely say it is or isn't. Regardless, all the music in the game is pretty great, and the whole soundtrack is an example of how in the proper hands the Genesis could produce nice soundtracks. The sound effects in the game are solid as well, and sometimes are very helpful in keeping up with the action on the screen. As you proceed through the game, not only will you play as the main character Spider-Man and Venom, but other New York-based superheroes that made appearances in the comic book will show up in the aforementioned cutscenes, and can be used in the game to help out during combat. Capcom would do something similar to this later on in the Marvel vs. Capcom series, with the inclusion of non-playable assist characters, although the functionality here is closer to the fire-based support attacks in the original Streets of Rage. I think this is a nice way of actually including other characters and expanding on the scope of the game beyond just Spider-Man and Venom punch a bunch of stuff. Don't get me wrong, I would still totally buy a game called that. Combat in the game does feature punching a lot of things, but it also involves a lot of grabs and throws. There are also objects in most levels that can be picked up and thrown to take out enemies. And there are power-ups in the levels that can either be gained from enemies or just laying around waiting to be picked up that can restore your health, or grant an extra life or even a continue. Pretty standard stuff for a beat-em-up, right? Well, what's not standard is both characters' ability to use their webbing. Spider-Man and Venom can reach out and grab enemies from across the level, swing across the level, or even crawl up the back wall and scene in certain places, and then jump down to attack. There's even a double attack where you can use your webbing to slam two characters together to knock them out, if you're surrounded. But it's tricky to pull off, and I've only accidentally done it twice. Also, for Venom and Spider-Man, while they play similarly, they are not the same character with a different skin. Venom is slightly stronger and slower, so certain things work better for Venom, but when you really need speed, Spider-Man's a better choice. Having characters with different abilities isn't a novel concept in beat-em-up games, but it is something they got right, as developer software creations could have just as easily been lazy and made them the same. Parts of the game also play out differently with completely separate levels in certain cases, depending on the character you choose, which adds a nice bit of replay value and means that not every playthrough of the game will be the same, unless you just always make the same character choices. Which, if so, that's kinda on you, you boring nerd. While the game has a nice control scheme that fits the superheroes, there are some things it gets wrong, and unfortunately those things come close to completely ruining the game. First thing you'll probably notice as you're playing through the game is that characters move fast. Maybe they don't move much faster than something like Final Fight or Streets of Rage, but it certainly seems like it, and it requires your timing to be that much better when attacking. Also, due to this more rapid than normal movement, it becomes increasingly likely that you might get surrounded when there are multiple enemies on the screen. I believe the double webbing based attack I referenced earlier was designed to help out with these kind of situations, but as I've said, I've had a lot of trouble getting it to work, so you may end up trying to super attack and jump button at the same time, your way out of it instead, which drains your health. However, the bigger issue for me with rapid movement is that heroes tend to grab enemies accidentally a lot of the time, and it seems to be a combination of faster character movement and the players having slightly longer reach than normal. I'll find myself walking towards an enemy so I can get close enough to punch it, but not grab it, and then all of a sudden I'm in a grab attack, which leaves you open to being attacked by another enemy while you deal with the one you're grabbing. This is especially a problem if you're playing as Venom, as his grab attacks are slower than Spider-Man's, meaning that you're much more likely to take damage when grappling. I hesitate to call the controls bad because they are responsive and relatively well designed, but they're a bit too responsive, I guess, is my complaint. This leads into the next issue the game has, and that's the overall difficulty set by the amount of health the heroes have versus the amount of health the enemies have, and the damage they both do to each other. Venom and Spider-Man both don't seem to deal very much damage for superheroes, especially to the regular enemies, much less the boss types. And on the opposite side, the enemies can chew through your life bar in a matter of seconds if you get stuck between two enemies, or are caught in a grapple by a second opponent. This gets really frustrating as you can have a decent level going, and then all of a sudden one bad wave of enemies hits, and you either lose a life or are left clinging to very little health. Surviving a boss on a sliver of health is a common trope in beat-em-ups, and it's usually okay because your life bar gets refilled at the beginning of the next level. Except that doesn't happen on every level of Maximum Carnage, and on those, good luck making it more than a few screens before succumbing again. To combat this, pun totally intended, most developers add in an options screen that allows you to do things like control the amount of continues and lives the characters start out with, and or adjust the overall difficulty of the game in case you need to balance things out. Here, nope, no options, not even a sound test or a controller configuration screen to adjust your button layout. The fact that the game is a bit on the cheap side as far as enemies are concerned, combined with the length of the game, would lead most developers to throw something in to make things more fun. But nope, not here. Instead, the developers thought it'd be better to throw hidden rooms in certain levels that contain power-ups, and otherwise hide other power-ups in levels assuming you know where to look. And all that is fine in the internet age, as players can now simply look up how to get to these secret rooms. But playing the game originally in 1984? Yeah, you'd be lucky to know how to get into one of those rooms, as there's no indication in the level of all where they are. Also, depending on who you choose to play as, Venom or Spider-Man, during certain sections, some of those secret rooms won't be available, making those paths certainly more difficult. All in all, I have to give Maximum Carnage a 2 out of 5. The LGN curse strikes again, and unfortunately, and possibly for the last time, as I think this was one of the last games made under the LGN banner before Acclaim retired it, this game is just too damn hard and frustrating. I'm okay with saying I didn't beat this one. I might be able to get there eventually, but there's just other things I'd rather be doing with my time than bang my head in the wall trying to get past the Prospect Park levels over and over. If you pick this one up, you'll know what I mean. If you really like beat-em-ups, and you're a fan of the comics, I'd give it a shot if you can find it cheap. But everyone else should probably stay far away. There's better games out there to be sure. Well, that was Maximum Carnage. A game that I can best describe as entertaining, but frustrating. Very similar to Sony's amazing Spider-Man movies. Sorry, Andrew Garfield. It's really interesting to me that after 25 years, I still think the game is kind of crappy. But now I can recognize that at least the graphics and music are actually really good, along with the cutscenes. It's just the gameplay that screws the pooch. Tune in next week when we take a look at a shooter that does not involve full motion video, which I think will be the first one we've done so far. And remember, whatever you play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.